this kind of awe of the unknown. Here these humans are, and they're controlling consciousness at the flip of a switch. The authors of this study advocate that we should move immediately towards human trials. They say we know enough about what is necessary for this sort of treatment to work that we should start experimenting in humans immediately. More than any other aspect of bodily function, consciousness is what defines life for humans. Many people can still remember the example of Terri Schiavo, who, unfortunately, at the age of 26, suffered severe cardiac arrest, depriving her body of oxygen and causing many parts of her brain to die and wither. As a result, her heart still beat, her lungs still breathed, and her gut still digested, but she had no conscious experience. And after a long and protracted legal battle, it was eventually decided that the ethically correct thing to do was to remove her feeding tube and allow her body to follow her mind. The issue turned on two difficult questions. First, is it the case that if somebody shows no signs of consciousness, that they are effectively dead? And second, if someone is effectively dead because of a lack of consciousness, is it the ethically correct thing to allow their body to die as well? Now, to answer the first question, it's necessary to define what we mean by signs of consciousness. Obviously, in most healthy human beings, you can simply ask them to demonstrate volitional action or respond to a particular stimulus. But what about the case where somebody is somehow unable to respond? Perhaps they're paralyzed, or perhaps they just don't have full control over their body, but their mind is still conscious inside. So to assess this, it becomes necessary to know what exactly are the brain signals that are associated with consciousness. And although it's a common trope that neuroscientists don't really understand consciousness, the reality is that the field is making advances quickly. So, two important aspects of brain function can be thought of as defining consciousness. First, the brain tends to go through a large number of state transitions from moment to moment in the conscious state. What this means is that the pattern of connectivity between different brain areas changes from moment to moment flexibly whenever somebody is conscious. A second thing that defines brain activity when someone is conscious is the brain's response to expectation or pattern violations. It turns out that the brain has a large response whenever there's a violation of some kind of a pattern in incoming stimuli, but this large response is entirely absent when someone is under anesthesia. The great thing about these two measurements is that they can be measured without any need for the patient to demonstrate volitional action or respond in any way. Thus, if we define consciousness in terms of state transitions in brain activity patterns and brain responses to pattern violations or expectation violations, then we can say whether or not a patient is conscious. But is this death? Well, if you believe in a soul and you believe that that life does not end until the soul leaves the body when that body ceases to function, then you might argue that no, that is not death. But from a medical, scientific, and legal perspective, society has generally decided that yes, if there's no consciousness, then death has occurred. And I think most people would agree, although perhaps uncomfortably, that they would not want to continue living if their consciousness was gone. After all, what is life if you're not conscious? The second question of whether or not it's the right thing to do to allow the body to follow the mind into death is a little bit easier. If we can agree that a lack of consciousness is a defining attribute of death, then whether or not to maintain the body once the consciousness has left it is really a question of whether or not it's worth the amount of effort and resources that it takes to maintain that body when there's no consciousness inhabiting it. And without any person inhabiting the body, that decision is relatively simple. Of course, an implicit assumption here is that we believe that the patient in this scenario will never regain consciousness. Obviously, a surgeon with a patient under anesthesia does not say, oh, my patient is non-conscious, therefore they are dead, let me let them go. In the case of Terri Schiavo, she had spent 14 years in a non-conscious state, and her autopsy report revealed that her brain weighed about half as much as would have been expected for somebody of her age, gender, and body weight. The reason her brain was so atrophied was because of the extensive damage that it had suffered during her cardiac arrest. Given all of this, there's really no chance that she would have ever regained consciousness. But for other patients, patients who perhaps have less severe brain damage but still lack consciousness, is there a chance that they can recover? Is it possible that we can restart damaged brains in the way that we restart damaged hearts? A paper lead authored by Jordi Tesseri and Lynn Orrig recently demonstrated that it is possible to use a specific type of brain stimulation to wake a monkey up and have that monkey regain consciousness despite that monkey being under deep anesthesia. Now, this raises the possibility that it might be possible using a technique like this to wake patients up who have a particular type of brain damage and allow them to regain consciousness through the use of targeted brain stimulation. Hi there, I'm Adam Dede, and welcome to a Neuroscience Journal Club, where I bring you a weekly discussion of a recently published peer-reviewed article from the world of neuroscience. So let's get right to it. Based on prior work, Tesseri and colleagues believed that the central thalamus was a key structure in the generation of consciousness. The central thalamus is located deep in the brain and has many connections both from and out to all over the brain. This central location and huge network of anatomical connections allows the central thalamus potentially to act as a coordinator or a switchboard between many parts of the brain. This is an important attribute of any area that we're going to think of as important for consciousness, because modern theories of consciousness increasingly emphasize that consciousness comes about as the result of mass action of many neurons distributed over many areas of the brain, coordinating their activity. So if it's true that the central thalamus plays a key role in the generation of consciousness, then the idea is that stimulating the central thalamus with targeted electrical stimulation might be a mechanism by which it's possible to restart consciousness even in an unconscious subject. So to test this, Tesseri and colleagues wanted to know, is it possible to have a monkey under deep anesthesia stimulate the central thalamus and affect a regaining of consciousness despite the monkey being under anesthesia? Now, it's important to think about this carefully. Anesthesia does not cause an animal or a human to go to sleep. Anesthesia actually stops the brain activity that generates consciousness. So it's really fundamentally different from sleep. As we all know, you can have many very conscious experiences in dreams while you're sleeping, but there's no such thing like that in anesthesia because it so completely stops the activity involved in consciousness. So given the idea that anesthesia is truly a total block on consciousness, is it possible to stimulate the central thalamus and wake monkeys back up and give them back their consciousness, even while they're under anesthesia? So to answer this question, the researchers surgically implanted electrical contacts in the central thalamus of the monkeys' brains. They also implanted electrical contacts targeting the ventrolateral thalamus to act as a control site to see if stimulation of the central thalamus and the ventrolateral thalamus would have different results. So here you can see a visual model of monkey head with its brain inside. The vertical object sticking into the monkey's brain represents the electrical stimulator. The researchers used MRI to target the surgical implantation of the stimulator. Now here you can see a zoomed in view of an MRI image of the thalamus. The stars indicate the location of the stimulation contacts in the central thalamus. The squares indicate the location of the stimulation contacts in the ventrolateral thalamus. The red and black indicators differentiate the locations of the stimulators in the two monkeys involved in the experiment. Now, the researchers confirmed the placement of the stimulation electrodes with postmortem histology. Here, you're looking at an image of one of the monkey's brains taken after it was removed and sliced. The stimulation electrode has been drawn on schematically, but you can see the researchers know where it was because of the track through the brain that was left when the stimulation electrode was inserted. So, with the methods out of the way, the big question: when the researchers stimulated the central thalamus and the ventrolateral thalamus of these monkeys while they were under anesthesia, what happened? Well, the short answer is the monkeys woke up. In this figure, you can see the arousal score of the monkeys in various states. On the left is the awake state. When awake, monkeys explore the surrounding world, make spontaneous movements, shake and prod things. They respond when their toes are pinched. Their eyes are open and they have a corneal reflex. When under anesthesia, all of these aspects of arousal are completely lost. When the researchers used low-intensity stimulation of the central thalamus, the monkeys began to explore the surrounding world, open their eyes, and regained corneal reflex. But they were still pretty out of it. They didn't respond to a toe pinch or make spontaneous movements. When the researchers turned up the intensity of the central thalamus stimulation, though, the monkeys woke up more fully. They regained spontaneous movements, started shaking and prodding, their eyes opened more fully, and they became responsive to toe pinches. I think it's worth taking just a second here and thinking about how surreal this must have been for the researchers. We can only imagine what the mood in that room must have been like when they did this central thalamus stimulation for the first time, but I can imagine it must have been one of kind of giddy nervousness, kind of excitement mixed with this kind of awe of the unknown. Here these humans are, and they're controlling consciousness at the flip of a switch. So next, the researchers wanted to check whether or not the effects that they found for stimulation of the central thalamus were specific to the central thalamus. So they stimulated the ventrolateral thalamus, and they found that indeed the ventrolateral thalamus, which does not have the same pattern of anatomical connections as the central thalamus, did not produce arousal. The monkeys stayed fully under the anesthesia even when they stimulated the ventrolateral thalamus at fairly high intensity. So this indicates then that central thalamus stimulation is very specific in its ability to modulate consciousness and wake these animals up from their anesthesia. So not only did the researchers want to look at these behavioral aspects of conscious arousal, they wanted to know what the brain activity of these monkeys looked like when they were experiencing the central thalamus stimulation. So while they were carrying out the brain stimulation experiments, they had the monkey in an MRI scanner so that they could take a look at the brain activity. So in these images, you can see partially inflated maps of the monkey cortex. The red and orange highlighted areas are the areas that increased their activation in response to stimulation. You can see that the high-intensity central thalamic stimulation, shown in the bottom left, led to a dramatic increase in activity across widespread areas of the brain. This was not true in any of the other stimulation conditions. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, consciousness is not really about just activity. It's really about transitions and flexibility in activity and in connectivity between areas. So it's important to think about how the brain evolves in its activity state over time. Does it change between multiple different types of states, which is going to be an indication of consciousness? Or does it tend to stay in one state and not really change very much, which is going to be an indication of a lack of consciousness? So to look at this, the researchers took a series of snapshots of brain activity across time. You can think about each of these as kind of capturing the pattern of connectivity between different brain areas at different discrete moments. Then they took these sets of snapshots, if you will, and they sorted them into different piles, where each pile of snapshots is being sorted based on having everything in that pile be very similar. So kind of all of the patterns of connectivity that maybe involve the prefrontal cortex connected to the parietal cortex are all in one pile, and in another pile, all of the patterns of connectivity that involve the visual cortex connected to the temporal cortex, for example, are in another pile, and so on. And what they found was that in the awake state, monkeys had 7 different states of brain connectivity patterns that they moved through, that their brains moved through. And there was about an equal probability of them occupying any one of these states at any particular moment. By contrast, when they looked at the same set of 7 brain states during anesthesia, what they found was that the monkeys really stuck in only one brain state. You can see on this graph, there's that state number 7 that the monkeys in the anesthesia condition seem to be occupying much more frequently than any of the other states. So then they took a look, okay, what happens when they stimulate the central thalamus? And as you might predict, that caused a regaining of the full repertoire of different brain states. So to unpack this a little bit more, it's important to think about what this analysis is really looking at. So the brain's anatomy does not change from moment to moment. But what we just saw in this analysis of brain states is that the state of connectivity between brain areas does change from moment to moment, at least when the monkeys are conscious. So this implies then that for at least some of these brain states, the brain must be exhibiting patterns of functional connectivity that are divergent from its underlying anatomy. That's the only possible way that you could have changes in functional connectivity while we know the underlying anatomy is not changing appreciably. So the researchers looked at this in a quantitative fashion. They asked for each of these 7 brain states, how similar is that brain state to the known and anatomical connectivity of the monkey's brain? And so on these graphs, what you can see on the y-axis is the similarity between the brain state and the known anatomical connectivity. So higher values on the y-axis indicate that the brain state is more similar to the anatomical connectivity. Then on the x-axis, they're plotting the probability of observing the monkey's brain in that particular state. So if it's the case that the monkey's brain activity is being entirely constrained by anatomy, then we should see that there's a very strong positive correlation where the monkey's brain state is much more likely to be in a state that's similar to the anatomy than in a state that is not similar to the anatomy. And what you can see here is that in the awake state, that correlation is quite flat. There's not a good relationship between anatomical connectivity on the y-axis and probability of being in that state on the x-axis. This indicates then that the brain is able to flexibly change its pattern of connectivity independent of its anatomy. And then if we look in the anesthesia condition, we can see a very different pattern. Under anesthesia, there is a very strong relationship indicating that in anesthesia, the activity pattern of the brain is really quite constrained by the anatomy. You're only going to see brain activity patterns that are similar to the anatomical connectivity of the brain. And then when we look at this same type of graph, but for central thalamic stimulation, you can see something that now again looks very much like the awake state, where the brain's activity patterns are now no longer constrained by anatomy. So this is another piece of evidence then that these monkeys were truly experiencing consciousness despite being under high doses of anesthesia drugs. Finally, an obvious and important part of consciousness is the ability to maintain awareness of incoming stimuli in your outside world. So to look at this, the researchers utilized a local global pattern violation paradigm. And basically what this means is a local violation. An example of this would be, let's say that you hear 4 low tones in a row followed by a high tone, kind of like a beep, 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 beep. So that last high tone is going to be a violation locally of the pattern of expecting low tones. And you can see that this is something that could be accomplished in a very reflex, very automatic kind of way. Now, by contrast, a global pattern violation is a situation where you get used to a certain pattern of change in these tones. So let's say that always there's 4 low tones followed by a high tone. And that's the pattern that you get used to. Over the course of many, many tone presentations, it's always 4 low followed by a high. But then, one time, there's a low tone where there was an expected high tone. So what's interesting about this is that on a local level, there's been no violation. Locally, you heard a low tone right after several other low tones. But globally, you've come to expect that after 4 low tones, there should be a high tone. So in this situation, you have an expectation because of a long-term pattern. And you can appreciate that this is a bit more of a complex pattern violation, which in prior research, it tends to require consciousness to be able to detect it. That is, participants who are aware of this sort of pattern violation show large amounts of brain activity response to it. But participants who are not aware of the pattern violation don't show the brain activity response. Thus, because these global pattern violations are so well studied, and it is known what the brain activity patterns look like in response to these pattern violations, it was possible for the researchers to take a look at what the monkey's brain's activity looked like in response to these global pattern violations, and ask the question, do these monkeys exhibit brain patterns as if they have awareness of the global pattern violation? The great advantage here is that they can do this without having to train the monkey to respond in any particular way. So in this figure, you can see the network of areas that were activated by global violations during central thalamus stimulation more strongly than during regular anesthesia. As you can see, the network is widespread and includes many more regions than auditory sensory cortices alone. This implies that the monkeys were very likely to have been experiencing conscious awareness of the stimuli. So overall then, what this set of data show us is that it is possible to stimulate the central thalamus of a monkey's brain while that monkey is under anesthesia and wake them back up into a conscious state. This finding holds the promise that in the very near future, it may become a recommended treatment for patients suffering from disorders of consciousness that they have brain implants to the central thalamus to stimulate the central thalamus and help them regain their consciousness, just as it is currently a common treatment to insert deep brain stimulating electrodes to help patients with Parkinson's disease. The age of cyborgs is ever advancing. Now, the researchers stressed that selecting patients for a treatment like this is going to be tricky. Obviously, in the study here, these monkeys are perfectly healthy and every part of their brain is entirely intact. So the question is, what type of brain damage might this sort of stimulation be helpful for? Obviously, if there's too much brain damage, then there's just nothing left even to stimulate, and it won't be possible to restart a brain that is functionally not there. And this was the case for Terry Schiavo, for example. As I mentioned earlier, her brain weighed only half as much as would have been expected for her age, body weight, and sex. So there probably wasn't enough brain tissue there that it would have even been possible to stimulate the central thalamus in order to wake her back up. But for other patients whose damage might be less extensive, this treatment could prove absolutely revolutionary. Now, although it's difficult to know exactly what type of patients might be most benefited by a treatment like this, the authors of this study advocate that we should move immediately towards human trials. They say we know enough about what is necessary for this sort of treatment to work that we should start experimenting in humans immediately. Now, of course, you could imagine, rather than going directly to human trials, that there could be a long series of monkey experiments in which you cause different deficits in consciousness by lesioning different parts of the monkey's brain, and then see if you can correct for these deficits through central thalamic stimulation. The authors of the research argue that this sort of study would actually just end up being horribly torturous for the monkeys involved, time consuming, and resource intensive. Instead, they argue that an approach should be taken whereby we slowly and carefully select human patients and skip immediately to human trials. So, this suggestion of skipping straight to human trials is really a big break with tradition and the way that these types of treatments have been developed in the past. So, what do you think? Do you think that we should skip straight to human trials with all of the potential risks that that involves? Or should we spend the time to do the monkey experiments, even though it has a huge amount of cost in terms of monkey lives, monkey suffering, and then human time and human effort? I'm not sure. What do you think? Anyway, that's it for this time. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you're liking the content, please subscribe, please leave a comment down below if you have any opinions about this. And if you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate some support on Patreon. The link is down below. Thanks.